Christmas morning in 1995, while the rest of the world leaned into warmth and noise and family, Dean Martin lay in a quiet Beverly Hills bedroom, watching a man he no longer recognized smile back at him from a television screen. And what unfolded in those final hours wasn't the graceful passing of a legend, but the slow, devastating reckoning of a man confronting the life he'd traded away for applause. The nurse who arrived before dawn expected another shift beside a dying celebrity. Instead, she witnessed something far more unsettling as Dean, frail and breathless, asked only that the TV stay on, that his old shows keep playing, as if noise might keep the silence from swallowing him whole. On the screen was the Dean Martin the world adored. Effortless charm, velvet voice, laughter on cue. But in the bed was Dino Crocetti, a tired man from Ohio who stared at that image like it belonged to someone else entirely. Someone who had borrowed his face and lived a life he barely remembered enjoying. He watched quietly at first, then with tears he didn't bother to hide, singing along in a broken whisper to songs that once defined him, until the truth finally surfaced. The man on the screen had died years ago, the moment his son Dino died in 1987, and everything since had been nothing more than a body waiting to catch up with a broken heart. As the hours passed, Dean spoke not to the nurse but to the ghost of himself, warning that fame fades, money evaporates, and applause goes silent, that the only moments that survive are the ones you miss while chasing the next curtain call, and that one unanswered phone call can echo louder than a lifetime of standing ovations. He admitted what no audience ever heard him say, that he chose the crowd over his children, the persona over the person, the safety of performance over the risk of being fully present, and that even knowing how it all ends, he would still make the same choice because the hunger for applause had become the only language he knew how to speak. When the TV played a Christmas special from decades earlier, young Dean singing White Christmas to thunderous applause, the older man watched with half-closed eyes and whispered apologies meant for sons, for lost years, for a version of himself he abandoned too early, finally confessing that he'd been a better entertainer than a human being. His final words weren't about legacy or fame, but about regret, about hoping there might still be a chance to say, "I'm sorry" to the people who mattered most. And as his younger self took a bow on television, the real man slipped away in silence, leaving behind a room full of echoes and a nurse who understood that she hadn't just watched a famous man die, but a deeply human one. Dean Martin's Last Christmas isn't a story about death so much as it's a warning about life, about how easy it is to mistake success for meaning, to confuse being adored with being known, and to wake up one day realizing you spent decades perfecting a performance while neglecting the person beneath it. Because when the lights finally go out and the screen goes dark, the only thing that matters is whether you were present for the people who loved you when no one was clapping. And the tragedy didn't end with the flatline or the quiet click of the television being turned off, because the truth of Dean Martin's final Christmas lingered long after his body was taken away, settling like dust over everything he left behind, a truth that no eulogy dared to touch. When his family arrived later that afternoon, they saw only the familiar image of a legend at rest, peaceful, dignified, famous even in death. But they didn't see the long hours spent confessing to a ghost, or the way his voice cracked when he spoke his son's name, or the way he flinched every time the audience on television applauded, as if each clap reminded him of something he'd traded away and could never buy back. The note on the bedside table was simple, almost painfully small for a man who'd lived such a large life, and that was the cruel irony of it all, that after decades of big stages, big laughs, big songs, The only thing he could leave behind were a few shaky words admitting he hadn't been enough. At the funeral, people spoke about Dean Martin, the icon, the smooth voice, the effortless charm, the man who made joy look easy, but none of them spoke about Dino Crocetti, the man who lay awake on Christmas morning staring at a younger version of himself and wondering where he'd gone wrong, wondering when exactly the performance became more important than the people waiting at home. The nurse stood quietly at the back, listening to the applause disguised as mourning, knowing that the real story would never fit inside a tribute or a headline, because it wasn't glamorous and it wasn't comforting. It was a warning. Dean Martin didn't die feeling misunderstood by the world. He died feeling that he had understood himself too late, realizing that success can be a disguise just as convincing as failure, that you can win at everything and still lose the only game that matters. He'd spent his life convincing millions that everybody loves somebody sometime. Yet in his final hours, he questioned whether he'd ever truly allowed himself to be loved as he was. Without the tuxedo, without the punchline, without the safety of a spotlight. And that is why his last Christmas matters, not because it reveals a scandal or a secret, but because it strips fame of its illusion and leaves behind something uncomfortably familiar. A man who kept promising himself he'd slow down tomorrow. A man who believed there would always be time to call back, to show up, to choose differently until tomorrow quietly ran out. Dean Martin's story isn't about celebrity, it's about the cost of living as a role for too long, about what happens when the applause fades and you're left alone with the choices you made when no one was watching. And that's why it stays with you, because somewhere in that quiet room on Christmas Day, 1995, watching a younger self take a bow was a reflection none of us can completely escape. The reminder that one day we will all sit with our own memories, our own performances, our own ghosts, and the only question that will matter then is whether we were brave enough to be present while it still counted. The tragedy didn't end when the television went dark, because what followed only deepened the quiet truth of that Christmas morning. As the nurse sat beside Dean's body, realizing that the applause he chased his entire life had never learned how to stay. When the family arrived, they mourned a legend, a voice, a symbol of an era, unaware that the man they loved had already said goodbye years earlier in ways none of them could hear. And when his daughter found the note beside the bed, the simple apology written in shaking ink carried more weight than every gold record and standing ovation combined. At the funeral, stories flowed easily about charm and laughter and unforgettable nights on stage, but the nurse stood in the back knowing the cruel irony that the man being celebrated had died believing he'd failed at the one role that mattered most. And she understood then that fame doesn't protect you from regret, it only delays it. Dean Martin had spent his life making it look easy, convincing the world that happiness was something you could rehearse and repeat on cue. Yet in his final hours, he learned that joy doesn't come from being adored by millions, but from being known by a few, and that success without presence leaves a hollow echo no amount of applause can fill. His last Christmas became a mirror not just for him, but for anyone willing to look. A reminder that every missed moment quietly compounds until one day it demands to be acknowledged. And by then, there are no encores left to save you. The cruelest part wasn't that he died alone, but that he finally understood why, realizing too late that the mask he wore to survive the world had cost him the ability to live in it. And as his story drifted into legend, what remained was not the image of a smiling man on stage, but the cautionary truth of a life spent performing when it should have been felt. Because in the end, Dean Martin didn't lose his voice, his fame, or his fortune. He lost time, And time is the one thing no applause can ever give back. Late to fix, and that is the cruelest truth hidden inside Dean Martin's final Christmas. That realization without time is its own kind of punishment, because clarity arrived only when his strength was gone and the future had already closed its doors. He didn't die angry at the world or afraid of what came next. He died understanding exactly where he went wrong and knowing there was no encore left to play. The applause he chased for decades could not sit beside his bed, could not hold his hand, could not answer him back when he finally spoke as Dino Crocetti instead of Dean Martin. And that is why this story lingers, because it isn't really about a celebrity at all. It's about the quiet danger of postponing what matters, of believing there will always be more time, more chances, more tomorrows. Dean Martin had everything except the one thing fame can never give back once it's gone: time.